Today we're going to talk about relative clauses. Let's take a look at some examples. The man who lives across the street from me is fixing the bike. Who lives across the street from me is an example of a relative clause. You might also know of these as adjective clauses because they describe nouns. They describe or modify or give more information. In this case, who lives across the street from me is describing the man. So the way these are constructed is from two separate clauses. Let's look at them separately. The man is fixing the bike is the independent clause. Who lives across the street from me is the dependent clause, the relative clause, or the adjective clause. We call this a dependent clause because it can't be a sentence by itself. Who lives across the street from me is not a complete sentence because of the word who. Who is the relative pronoun. If we change this word to he, subject pronoun, then it's a possible sentence and is an independent clause. He lives across the street from me. So, notice that in these two sentences, the man and he refer to the same person. So we can make a relative clause or an adjective clause out of one of the two independent clauses we have here. How do we do that? Well, we change he to the relative pronoun who. For people, we can use who or that. That makes this clause a relative clause. Then we can insert it into the main clause. Always remember to put your adjective clause, your relative clause, after the noun that you're modifying. In this case, the man. The man who lives across the street from me is fixing the bike. Notice that in our two sentences, in the main clause, the subject was the man, and in the relative clause, the sentence we made the relative clause out of, he is also in the subject position. But it doesn't have to be this way. We can modify the object of the main clause with a relative clause in which the bike is in the subject position. So in this case, we have two sentences. The man is fixing the bike. The bike is old. How do we make this into a relative clause? Well, we change the bike into which. For objects, we use which or that. So our relative clause is which is old. We insert that into the sentence right after the noun it's modifying, in this case, the bike. So we have the man is fixing the bike, which is old. That's our relative clause. We can also make relative clauses with a focus on the object in the relative clause. So here's an example. The man is fixing the bike. I know him. Him in this case is the object, but it's the same person as the man. How do we make a relative clause? Well, we change him to the relative pronoun. In the case of objects, we use whom. Whom is formal. It's the most correct answer. You may also hear native speakers use who in the object position. Whom is quite formal, and especially in spoken English, you will almost never hear it. You can also use that, as we said, for people. Who, whom, or that in object position. Whom is the most formal. That is probably the least formal. How do we make this a relative clause? Well, now that we have a relative pronoun, we move it to the front of the clause. So that I know is our relative clause, and we put it right behind, right after the noun we're going to modify, in this case the man. So we have the man that I know is fixing the bike. This is our relative clause. How do we know, or how do we remember that the relative pronoun that is an object? Well, we have I, which is the subject. If you have a subject, the relative pronoun must be the object. Let's look at one last example. It's also possible to modify the object with a relative clause that focuses on the object. So if we have the man is fixing the bike and I gave the bike to him, it's possible to make a relative clause out of the second sentence. How do we do that? Well, again, we change the bike to the relative pronoun which in this case. Could use that as well. We move it to the front of the clause, and then we use this relative clause to modify. We put it right behind the noun that we're modifying, in this case the bike, and we get the man is fixing the bike which I gave to him. So notice here are all four of our example sentences. We can modify the subject with a relative clause in which the pronoun is the subject. We can modify the object with a relative clause in which the relative pronoun is the subject. We can modify the subject with a relative clause in which the relative pronoun is the object. And we can also modify the object with a relative clause in which the relative pronoun is the object. So any combination of these is possible. You can use any combination. Now let's look at one more relative pronoun that can be a bit confusing. In this case, the relative pronoun is whose. The man whose driveway is empty is fixing the bike. Whose refers to possession. So let's look at two sentences. The man is fixing the bike. This is our main clause. If we have the man's driveway is empty or his driveway is empty, notice in both of these cases we have a possessive, either the apostrophe s, the man's driveway, or a possessive pronoun, his driveway. If we want to make these two sentences, either of these two sentences, into relative clauses, the relative pronoun we replace the man's with or his with is whose in both cases. So either way, whose driveway is empty is the relative clause. And since this describes the man, we put it right after the noun it's modifying, and we get the man whose driveway is empty is fixing the bike. This is our relative clause. Notice too that objects can also be possessive. In this case, the man is fixing the bike. The bike's chain is broken. So which chain? The bike's chain. In this case, even though it's an object, even an object as in a thing, okay, it's in subject position, but even though it's a thing, it can still possess something. The bike has a chain. So in this case, we replace the bikes with whose as well. Whose chain is broken. And we put that right after the bike because we're describing the bike, and we get the man is fixing the bike whose chain is broken. Even though bike is an object, it can still possess something. Be careful with these. Why do we use relative clauses? Great question. Let's say we don't have one man, we have two men. And let's say the man on the left is working on the bike, but the man on the right is working on a robot. Okay? So these two men are both men, but there are some differences. And if we just say the man, it's unclear who we're referring to. So we can use an adjective clause, a relative clause, to identify which of the men we're referring to. Let's look at an example. If I say the man whose shirt is blue is fixing the bike, then you know of these two men, I'm talking about the one with the blue shirt. The man whose shirt is blue is fixing the bike. Again, this is a relative clause, an adjective clause. I could also say the man whose shirt is purple is fixing the robot. Again, I'm identifying which man is working on which object. Now, we also sometimes use adjective clauses in a non-specifying or non-identifying, or sometimes even we call it non-restrictive way. So if there is only one man, and I'm just adding extra information about him, I could say the man whose shirt is purple is fixing the robot, if there's only one man. But if there's more than one man, we don't use commas. Notice, if we're adding extra information, we add commas. All of our examples so far have been specifying or identifying, or sometimes you'll hear these called restrictive as well. This is because we're specifying which of the two men we're talking about. Which man? The man whose shirt is purple is fixing the robot. So we're specifying the man, we're identifying which one. The reason this is called restrictive is because we're restricting the possible men we can be talking about to the one with the purple shirt. Let's talk for a minute about reducing relative clauses. It's possible to reduce these, and you'll hear these very, very often. So, if the relative pronoun in a relative clause is an object, it's possible to reduce the relative clause. For example, the man that I know is fixing the bike. In this case, that, the relative pronoun, is the object. And one quick way to double check if this is the case is, do you see a subject after the relative pronoun? I is the subject of the verb know. So we know that that is not the subject in this relative clause. It's the object. So in this case, that is the object, and we can reduce it by taking out the relative pronoun. We can say, the man I know is fixing the bike. We can reduce this relative clause. You can never reduce the subject. You can never eliminate the subject, but you can eliminate the object. If the relative pronoun is an object, you can eliminate it. Except if you have a very formal structure, like the man with whom I work is fixing the bike, and you've moved the preposition with the relative pronoun, which is often done in formal writing, you cannot simply eliminate the relative pronoun and get the man with I work is fixing the bike. This structure is not possible. So because of the preposition with, it's not possible to reduce this relative clause. Now, if you have an auxiliary be verb, for example, in the progressive, the man that is standing in my driveway is fixing the bike. Or if you have an auxiliary be verb with the passive, for example, the man that is getting yelled at is fixing the bike. In these cases with the auxiliary be, it's possible to reduce the relative clause. The way you do that is you eliminate the pronoun and the auxiliary be verb. And you get the man standing in my driveway is fixing the bike. Or the man getting yelled at is fixing the bike. If a man is fixing your bike, don't yell at him, but this is just an example. Also, if you have a be verb plus a prepositional phrase, for example, the man that is at my house is fixing the bike. In this case, it's also possible to eliminate the relative pronoun that and the be verb is, and you'll get the man at my house is fixing the bike. This is another possible reduction. Finally, if you have the verb have, and the meaning is possession, for example, the man who has a set of tools is fixing the bike, or in the negative, meaning lack of possession, the man who has no fear is fixing the bike, it's possible to take out who has, or who has no, who has plus the negative, and replace them with or without. And you would get the man with a set of tools is fixing the bike, or the man without fear is fixing the bike.